welcome back to PA Chalk Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Paul. Hi, Paul. How are we doing?
Good, Manny. Thanks for inviting me onto the podcast.
It's all good. We spoke in Switzerland. It was me, Tim, and yourself, and I was fascinated by the amount of effort that you are taking to make research real life application for strength coaches and coaches that want to develop their athletes. So it's a pleasure to have you on. But before we get going, could you just let everyone know who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are? As a strength coach and a business owner, my time is quite limited. My favorite part about being a coach is the fact that I get to interact with athletes and be with athletes and really coach them. That's why I use TeamBuildr. I remember the days of searching for exercises, manually typing them in, and spending hours on spreadsheets and organizing my programs. This tends to be quite tedious and a lot of time consuming, which meant that I wasn't able to coach as much. So now for my business, TeamBuildr is a non-negotiable. It's an all-in-one programming platform that lets you create and deliver workouts to your athletes just in a few clicks. With TeamBuildr, I can customize programs, track athletes' progress in real time, and generate performance reports. My athletes get full ownership of their progress and can even share feedback on how they felt the session's going. Having this in place actually gives me more time to coach and be with my athletes. If you're ready to take your next step in your programming, give more time to your athletes, head over to teambuildr.com and use promo code PAChalkup, that's PACHALQUP, and start your 30-day free trial.
Yep, no problem at all. So I'm Paul Comfort. I'm a professor of strength and conditioning at the University of Salford in the UK. We're pretty much on the outskirts of Manchester, part of Greater Manchester. I've been there now. I'm in my 18th year. Prior to that, I was at Middlesex University and then worked for the University of Essex at a college in Southend and at Southampton University before that. So been doing this quite a while. Prior to that, I was personal training while I was doing my degree and my master's degree. That was it was before strength and conditioning was a thing in the UK, way before the UK Strength and Conditioning Association. So most of my stuff back then was really either working with wealthy people that wanted to just get in better shape to go on holiday, and then they'd come back of holiday and would be in poor shape again. So they'd want more personal training, or it was the local athletes who just wanted to improve their performance. And that really sort of inspired me and motivated me to look in a lot more detail at the sports performance side of things rather than looking at things for aesthetics. Because once you get working with some athletes, it's surprising how much you can get them to develop if you train them appropriately. And then most of the way through my academic career working in universities, I've been lucky enough to work with either the university teams or at the University of Salford, where we are now. We've got links with a whole range of different football, rugby league and rugby union teams, which again still gives you that insight and helps to really inspire some of the research. Some of the practitioners come up with some fantastic research questions that are very, very real world. We have to think, right, how do we try and answer some of those questions to give that real world sort of insight to make sure that our research is applicable and can be transferred into the real world rather than just being stuff we do in a lab.
Perfect. How did you sort of start wanting to become a professor in strength and conditioning? Because it is still a relatively new industry in Europe in general, but specifically in the UK. How did that sort of come about where you were like, yeah, this is what I want to do and push that industry a little bit further this side?
Well, most of it is just wanting to learn more. And my wife still asks me when I'm going to stop being a student because she basically considers it what I'm doing for a job most of the time, or the majority of the time now in terms of research is me just doing dissertation after dissertation after dissertation or guiding other people through it most of the time now. So a lot of it was sort of through reading initially before I started my own degree. And then during my degree, I came up with more and more questions. Did my master's, got more questions, start doing other research, and then a PhD, and you end up with more questions. If you think about it, every time you read a research paper, at the end of the discussion, it has limitations and areas of future research. So you might have answered or partly answered one research question, and at the end of each publication, you've probably got another 4 or 5 research questions. That is really, really interesting, but actually then seeing how we can apply that in the real world and how we can
Mm.
use that to improve athletes' performances outside of a more controlled environment. That's the bit that's really interesting. And as I said, starting off before strength and conditioning was a thing in the UK, and just having to either get a lot of the translated European manuscripts and books or getting some of the stuff from the National Strength and Conditioning Association and thinking, well, how do we apply this? If a lot of the research, especially, if you go back 30 years ago, it was collegiate athletes in America, but that's completely different. You look at the length of their off seasons and then compare that to the off season and pre-season in something like professional football in the UK. They're completely different. So all of the reading and the research I was doing was really making me think, well, how does this apply in this situation? How does it apply here? What if we do this differently? So we know there are all these different training methods at work, but which one works the best? Now, you can't compare every single training method in a study because you'd need
Mm.
thousands of participants. But it's really,
Works.
yeah. It's the more you read and the more you learn, the more you find there are other research questions, and um, yeah, you start to critique things and think about how you can make your own practice when you're working with athletes better, how you can make your own training. Well, for me, it was my own training going back years. Now I'm just training for fun and to keep up with some of the students when we're teaching them the practical side of things. So really, it was just that passion for learning and then trying to enhance what I was doing either in my training or training with athletes to try and optimize things where possible. And as I said, the
Yeah.
more you learn, the more you end up with more questions.
Yeah, we've previously spoken about this, and you and Tim do a lot of research together, and your biggest thing is making it applicable to the real life coaching industry, and it's something that you've touched on. How how have you found that when the industry as a whole, the science community, want to just stick with controlling every variable, and obviously you can't control all variables in sport? How has that sort of developed over the years with research that you've sort of published and came out with?
Uh, it's an interesting sort of discussion or debate that you can have with people, because if you chat with people that work in more of a pure physiology or biology type lab, and they might be looking at individual muscle fibers, stimulating them with an electrical current, etc., and you get a certain response. But then that never works and applies when we look at it whole body. There's a lot of information we can gain from that. But my sort of perspective is, let's do stuff with athletes where we know if we follow some basic scientific principles, and that could be something as simple as progressive overload, which is still used incorrectly in a lot of places. But let's apply those principles correctly, see if something works. If it does work, let's then do the more controlled studies to try and figure out, well, why did it work, or how can we improve it to make it better, or ultimately, if it didn't work, why didn't it work? And then we can do those more controlled studies to try and refine the processes that we're using. And it's quite difficult in some situations. If you look at some of the let's say, for example, some of the correlational type research, is there an association between, let's say, maximum strength and sprint performance? Yes, there is. And there's loads of studies that show us that. But that doesn't mean that there's cause and effect between them. So then you have to start looking and go, well, if I do a training intervention and I increase someone's maximal strength, do they then get faster? And going back to your original point, you then can't control everything. They're still doing their technical and tactical training. They still might have a little bit of sprint training within there. But what we then see is that actually, if they get stronger, they generally do get faster. And the weaker people improve their sprint performance the most in most cases if we start looking at an individual level. But everything's got to be on a continuum, because if you
Mm.
go just let's not control anything, we don't know why things happened or why things didn't happen that we expected to happen. So you have to control enough of those variables so that we've got some scientific rigor there. But actually, if we control every single variable, then you try and apply it in the real world and it just doesn't work. So we've got to do things across this continuum and keep, sort of sliding along the continuum or balancing the scales in terms of how much control and rigor do we have and how much do we have in terms of making it ecologically valid so it can apply in that real world. And that will shift depending on, the athletes you're working with and who your participants are. Because You wouldn't believe the amount of studies that I've started with team sport environments where the head coach has bought into it, and then 2 or 3 weeks in, they've lost 2 or 3 games in a row, and everything gets thrown out the window and everything changes. And you sit there going, "Oh, this would have been so good," and we were getting some really nice changes, but then they had a few losses, not at all due to any of the training you were doing or anything else. It was, they played a much better team. We knew they were going to lose, but the coach was hoping they would win, or whatever happened. So yeah, there's a lot of studies like that that have been started, and we've got data up to a certain point, and then gone, we can't continue with this because the coach changed everything,
Hmm.
or just went right. We're stopping the study. We're doing something totally different now. That in itself is really interesting, and you learn a hell of a lot from it. But it normally also gives you data for other purposes at the same time.
What do you do in that situation where the coach just completely disregards everything? I know it's obviously not up to you to do anything about it, but like, how do you handle like that disturbance and all that data and time that you spent on collecting it?
Um, Put your head in your hands and cry.
Fair,
No, so
fair.
yeah, it varies. Sometimes you can be far enough into a study that you just have to make the study that bit shorter than was planned. What I've learned from that very early on is to make sure that the head coach, the manager, whoever really oversees everything, has the final say. Where possible, they're involved in all the decision making at the beginning, and they know why you're doing the study, and they know the importance of it. Not to me, but the importance for them and their athletes, and it's going to answer certain research questions, because that tends to make them be less reactive. It's not that they're not reactive, because again, if they lose a few games in a row, you see it on TV on a weekly basis, don't you? A new manager or a new coach gets fired because they've had X number of losses. So, your research is not their priority. Them winning and keeping their job as their priority, but it's making sure you have as good a level of communication with them as possible. Make sure they're involved and they know what's going on, why it's happening in a certain way, and the more you can do that, better. Everything turns out. There are still situations where a couple of weeks in, they just pull the plug. We're not doing it. We're doing it my way. Um,
Mm,
it rarely makes a difference to the performance on the next few games, but you've just got to admit that that's real world. That's how things are.
yeah.
It tends to work better, to be honest. If you were looking at the most elite level, that's tough. If you look at lower levels, coming down the different football leagues, for example, then you tend to get more buy-in. The coaches tend to want to listen more, and you're providing them with a service with testing and training and upskilling their staff, which they probably can't do without you there. So sometimes that is a real benefit to them. We've gone in just done some really simple stuff, probably the last 4 pre-seasons with a whole range of football teams from the lower leagues right the way up to sort of the championship. And they're more than happy for us to go in and do all the preseason testing, collect a huge amount of data across multiple age groups, etc., in the men's and the women's game, purely because at the lower level they haven't got many staff, they haven't got much technology. If they're lucky, they've got a set of force plates, but we'll turn up with a team of people, 6 or 7 sets of force plates, plus whatever else we need, and test a whole squad across multiple tests within less than an hour. And it runs, it's almost like a Formula One pit stop when we go in and do that.
Mm,
But it means that in a day we can test 6 or 7 different age groups, and turn all the data around. So by the time we've packed all the equipment up, we've automatically generated all the reports for each individual athlete. So when they can see a benefit to them and a bit of a service that's being provided for them, that works as well, because they're actually seeing that they're benefiting from these things as well. Um,
yeah.
and that can be really interesting, because then some of those clubs, you'll go back in 4, 6, 8 weeks later, and they've really used that data. Others, you go back in and go, oh no, we carried on with the training we planned anyway. And then after an
Hmm.
8 week period, they're saying, well, oh, they didn't improve as much as we expected them to. So, well, you didn't train the right physical characteristics based on what we'd identified. But again, that keeps it real world. It's really showing them that, sometimes it's almost like an auditing process, that you're going, well, look, we collected all this data. We showed you these are the training priorities, but you actually trained their strengths rather than their weaknesses.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned something earlier, and I kind of want to get into a little bit. You mentioned that progressive overload doesn't get applied the way it's supposed to most of the time. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, certainly if you look at, if you go right back to the way that Delorme did his research back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, using it to rehabilitate primarily injured military personnel. And it was the 3 sets of 10. And it was back then, it was let's go to momentary muscle failure. It doesn't matter if they're fatigued the next day. We probably don't want to do that with elite athletes because they still have all this other training to do. 3 sets of 10. Once they can do 3 sets of 10, then we can up the load. Because obviously, if it's a 10 RM and you do 10 reps your first set, you might be lucky and get 7 or 8 your second set, and then 5 or 6 on the third set, and that's it. But if you look at Delorme's research, there was this steady sort of progression for a period of time, and then it would plateau. It'd improve, and then it would just plateau for a while. So then he started looking at, well, let's use heavier loads. And if you use heavier loads and do like 5 or 6 RMs, they improve strength more. The higher volumes with the 10 or 12 or 15 RMs start to, create a greater hypertrophic response. But then if you keep alternating those two, so, a month of one and then a month of the other, you get an increase in cross-sectional area, then you get an increase in strength, partly because of that cross-sectional area, and then you repeat. And that process works really effectively. But what tends to happen is people, if you look especially in rehab settings, and this is not everyone, I am generalizing, but they'll be doing 3 sets of 10, then they'll go to 12, then to 15, and the reps keep going up. But they said they wanted to increase strength. Well, you're not really focusing on strength at that point, it's muscular endurance. So you will get some increases in strength, but it's going to bias it more towards muscular endurance. And it's then just getting that balance right. If we want to increase muscle mass, we need to increase volume. If we want to increase strength, we need to be increasing the load. And that's specificity. That gives us our specific adaptation to impose demands. So add load, make them generate higher forces, they will get stronger. Preferentially get stronger. There'll be some increase in muscle mass as well. Flip that around, give them much higher volumes, they'll increase muscle mass and get some increases in strength. But again, it's on a continuum, and we need to alternate that and use it at the right times, and also make sure then that we've used it in the appropriate sequence as well. If you've got an
Yeah,
athlete that doesn't have much muscle mass, that's got to be your starting point.
yeah. So you're kind of saying that you kind of have to look at, again, specific adaptations that you're tracing the load, like the progressive of load, and that could be time under tension, that rest time reduced, and the intensity factors that go into it,
Yeah.
and see how can I get from A to B while making it progressively harder throughout the session and the periodization program.
Yeah, yeah, and it is really just a case of keeping it simple. The basic exercises work, and they work really well. They've worked well for decades, probably centuries, if we could go back and trace it that far. And not trying to mimic sporting movement patterns. Actually, let's
Mm.
have a look at these are the muscle groups that are being worked. This is how we create overload. This is how we stress whichever tissue it is or whichever system in the body we're trying to stress. So it could be the same for aerobic fitness as for resistance training. If we want to create adaptations in the heart, we need to stress the heart. It's a muscle; it will adapt like any other muscle, or similarly. So we just need to make sure that we create overload in the correct manner, and also make sure we consider that where are we in the season? Do we really want to be doing high volumes of hypertrophy training in season? That's the most fatiguing. It gives you a massive depletion of glycogen. It's more likely to cause residual fatigue and muscle soreness than if we do really heavy strength training and don't go anywhere near momentary muscle failure.
Yeah. I like that you said sport specific. You shouldn't always focus on that. And one thing that I always say is the fundamentals are the fundamentals for a reason. Like I spoke to Mike Boyle about this, and he was like, "Yeah, because you know they've been around for centuries." Again, if we look at Milo or um, the hunter gatherer type era, where they were just having to survive and really run and do all this heavy lifting to survive. It's like you don't start as a baby chasing the lion, but at some point you'll get there, and it's that thing where slowly and surely you will get there if you do these progressive steps adequately. My other question is, what's your thoughts on TikTok and Instagram exercises?
Uh, there's some stuff on there that's really good. You've got to say there is some stuff that is good that's on there, and there's a few people that I've seen on Instagram who will regularly critique certain things and say, look, this influencer who has no qualifications is suggesting this. This is why it's wrong, and this is why they've misinterpreted certain things. There was actually a really good post by Brett Contreras, the glute guy,
Hmm.
a, a week or so ago, where he'd actually put something on there which said, don't comment on this until you've looked at it right to the end. And basically, what he was putting on there is a whole load of stuff to almost try and sell, not a product, but sell a way of thinking or a way of training. And then right at the end, it's like, this is how easy it is to influence people, because people will have believed some of this, and most of this is wrong. And it was a really nice post that he'd put the information on there just to get people thinking and to create, a bit of controversy. But then at the end, clearly said, look, I've done this in the way that a lot of people do it to get more clicks and get more hits on their account. But actually, it's totally wrong. This is the way you should be doing certain things. Um, I've got to admit, I did keep going through it thinking, oh, come on, get to the point, will you? Because it was taking a long time. But it made a really good point. And I actually shared that with some of my students. Said, right, read through this. And some of them were going, oh, so is this the way you should be doing it? Halfway through. They hadn't read to the end like it had said. And others were going, no, surely this is wrong. This doesn't make sense. If we follow these basic principles, this doesn't make sense. But not everyone has the ability to critique those sorts of things. Not everybody is educated well enough to be able to do that. And, it's like you think back to the old sort of health and fitness, bodybuilding magazines and stuff. You've got a guy
That's
there
how I
who's
started.
absolutely ripped, in great shape, holding this thing of protein powder, saying, take this, you'll look like me. That's not what made that person look like that. It's a lot of training, good genetics, and a hell of a lot of drugs as well in most cases for the bodybuilding community.
Hmm.
But again, people believe blindly what they see in the media, and
Hmm.
that's
This can also be applied in our industry as well. Like I'm sure you're not blind to the amount of methodologies and principles out there in this industry. And like I talk to a lot of people who have a wide range of beliefs when it comes to developing the athlete. I'm not there to disagree with them. I'm there to understand why and like sort of understand their program and as to why they've came up with those set principles. Like if we take triphasic for an instance or conjugate, French contrast, like those systems work really well for that type of athlete that coach coached, right? For me, I don't have those athletes, so I'm going to pick a little bit style like from triphasic, from conjugate, from French contrast, from the tier system, from all these systems that work well with my program. Because again, my athletes need a little bit of that, and it's the way that I coach, the way that my principles and philosophies have been built. So, like, what's your take on that when you're in relation to that sort of being not critical, but like being able to critique different programs and seeing what would come to your
yeah.
program the best?
Well, I think first of all, what you've got to do is look at those programs. Why do they work, and why do they work with those athletes? And most of the time, is they still follow the principles of progressive overload. So if you think about something like triphasic training, it still has progressive overload built into it. Although you obviously focus, some on the eccentric, the isometrics, etc.
Yeah.
But it still creates progressive overload. But again, then what we need to go back to with some of this is, well, what are the key underlying principles? What's the underlying biomechanics and what's the underlying physiological approach in terms of what are we stimulating? What's the adaptation? What's the time course for it? And even if you just look at things like something like eccentric training or isometric training, the benefits we have from those types of training are we can generate much higher forces than we can during a concentric muscle action. So if you use isometric as an example, if you're not rehabilitating somebody, why are you doing submaximal prolonged isometrics? The whole purpose of the isometric muscle action is we can generate really high forces and we generate force really quickly. So if you're doing a lot of submaximal isometrics, is that really giving us the best bang for our buck with that type of training? Same with eccentric training. If you do a really slow controlled descent down, but it's not super maximal, well, we're not really taking advantage of it. Now, there are times when we might want to do that to focus on technique, and to create that increased time under tension, to familiarize the athlete with those types of movement patterns before we go super maximal.
Hmm.
And again, this is where if you look at things on social media, you don't always get the context,
Yep.
which is a
Just
problem.
the
But
1%.
if we
Yeah.
yeah, but if we go back to those basic principles, if we look at muscle actions, eccentric and isometric muscle actions allow us to generate much higher forces. So if we're not taking advantage of that, what's the purpose in really doing it? Now, again, it may be something like eccentrics, we get a repeated back effect. So it creates that protective effect so that over the next 7 to 9 days, if you repeat it, you'll get far less, if any, muscle soreness whatsoever. Now, that could be great going into a tournament structure if you're working with your national team. Um, but you've got to apply these things appropriately and at the right times. And again, have the context to, well, why is this being done in a certain way? So, I think as you've described there, for your own practice, you have to look at all these different methods. We have to evaluate them, see what works, why does it work. But all programs that work generally have progressive overload in them, or
Hmm.
they work for a short period of time because it's a novel stimulus. And we throw a bit of novelty in there and you get an adaptation because of the novel aspect. But then if you're novel all of the time, you don't get any consistency and you don't get prolonged and steady improvements in performance.
100%. I will bring it up again, but the podcast I did with Tim, he said something that was really interesting to me. And there was, when you're coaching an athlete during their full season, you kind of have to look at a bell curve, right? So you start on like developing tendon strength, the isometrics, the foundation of strength, to then towards the end of say the preseason, you're into that more explosive, more high reaction phases. And I really like that because you can sort of like put these methodologies in like this curve. So you can like start with the triphasic and then up in French contrast. So you're kind of like progressively overloading through these methodologies. And I found that like super interesting and a different way of thinking about picking apart these programs and really trying to understand again those adaptations. What are we chasing and what do we need to provide our athletes? In terms of DOMs and again these adaptations to our training implementations, what are some of your advice when they are in season and competing to reduce again, still chase some of those adaptations but mitigate those sort of onset from working out as hard?
Yeah, it's the soreness comes from a range of different things. A novel stimulus, a movement pattern they're not used to doing, training at long muscle lengths, dramatic increase in stability. So if you've had somebody that's only been doing bilateral resistance exercises and suddenly you take them into a split stance, you're going to find that their glutes, their adductors, etc., they're going to be beaten up the next day. So one of the things to try and do is make sure you've always got a combination of those types of exercises. So you're not just training bilaterally, that there is some split stance or unilateral type movement patterns weekly in their training. And, don't completely remove things like Romanian deadlifts from people's training program. Because if you're not used to being at those long muscle lengths, again, you will get some soreness the first few times you go back to it. Nordic hamstring exercise, if you're implementing that in your program regularly, whether you love it or hate it, we've got some evidence from two of our PhD students to show if you take that out of someone's training program for 2 weeks, fascicle length starts to shorten and eccentric
Mm,
strength reduces substantially, unless you are doing some very heavy things like RDLs in place of them. But if you take them away, when you reintroduce them, athletes are sore. So having a smaller volume of those, they're still very high intensity exercises, but a small volume so that it doesn't suddenly become a novel stimulus. And that might mean you have Nordics in your program one day in the week pre-season and RDLs another time. You might have some heavy split stance type movement as well, to make sure those stabilizers are still working hard and that doesn't create a novel stimulus, but also to make sure that you don't get disproportionately strong during a bilateral exercise and compared to your split stance. And that's generally because it's the stabilizers that are weak. So it's shifting the balance on some of those things. If you're in a period where you want to get really strong, the bilateral stuff tends to work much better
Mm,
because you're stable. But actually, then, if you've been doing just bilateral work for an extended period, then you go to unilateral. The unilateral will catch up, or split stance will catch up pretty quickly, but it creates that novel stimulus. So it's a case of making sure that you've trained the athletes hard enough and with a high enough volume when it's not in season, so that in the season you can do a sufficient dosage and sufficient intensity that it actually doesn't fatigue them too much. So you might have been doing 5 sets of 5 on whatever exercises you've been doing pre-season. If you then start doing 3 sets of 3 of those same movement patterns in season, well, you're not going to be sore. You're not going to be fatigued because you're used to such a high volume. And then you can look across the season and identify, well, where are there periods where you might not have as higher sort of period of fixture congestion? When can we actually add a slightly greater stimulus? If a game gets cancelled, what normally happens? Oh, we can have a rest day, we can recover. Should you always be doing that? Should you go, hang on a moment, we haven't really given much of a strength stimulus for a period of time. It's just been maintenance. Now we've got some
mm,
opportunities to push them a bit harder. But you have to balance that across their entire workload. It's not just the stuff in the gym, it's what distances they've been covering on the pitch, the court, whatever their sport is. Um, but yeah, really trying to make sure that you've pushed them hard enough early on in the sort of off season and pre-season. So when you're in season, you can drop the volumes so that they're not too sore or fatigued, but still maintain a sufficient stimulus for the adaptations that you need in the athlete.
100%. I had a Steph Mock or Grubs now on the podcast a while back, and we actually discussed load management. And again, when I say load management, I already come with the thought process that people should know that load management goes in both ways. Yes, you need to control how much and sometimes reduce it, but you also need to consider it the other end where you need to up it and scale it to what their performance is throughout the season. And one of the things that we sort of discussed was even with um, people who are benched, like after the game, that is just as important. So, like, the same amount of load needs to be put through their hamstrings, through their running, through their cardiovascular system. Everything needs to sort of align with everyone that played that day. What's your take on like this sort of load management era that we're in and people wanting to reduce and control and sort of put put that load management in that box?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an over obsession with recovery, and let's back off so that they can recover. But actually, what we know from the limited research which is out there, if you're stronger, you recover faster, and if your aerobic fitness is higher, you recover faster. So you don't end up going into as big a hole during whatever your competition is. So having people fitter, faster, stronger at the start works and works really well. There's some really interesting research which shows that actually the intensities and that people are working at sometimes in games isn't as hard as we think they are. And again, a lot of that data is presented in terms of absolutes rather than relative. So if you and I go out and play a game of football and we cover exactly the same distance, do the same amount of high speed running, well, if you're fitter and faster and stronger than me, it was submaximal for you. It could have just written
Mm-hmm.
me off for the next 48 hours. So we need to consider that in terms of that relative level. But we also need to make sure that if we're backing off in, trying to manage load too frequently by decreasing load, and it's load management, it's not decrease load. And as you said, sometimes you need to be topping people up. They need to do more. But it's also identifying, well, more of what? What is the key stimulus
Mm-hmm.
that they need? How do they normally play? And that's really interesting when you look across positional groups or individual positions, because you can see two people that play the same position in a football or a rugby team, but actually their load and their accelerations, decelerations, total distance, high speed running, completely different profiles. So we've got to individualize it where possible. Now, at the elite levels, you've got the staff and you've got the technology to do that. Once you drop below that, then what do? Or take it to the other extreme, you're working with a national team. And I've got one of my previous PhD students and a couple of existing PhD students work with some national squads, and you then have a look at the data that they're getting, And a lot of the clubs are worried about the volume of training that they'll do when they're, in a tournament structure. But what they don't do is they don't increase the volume of training before their
Mhm.
athletes go and play with a national squad. That would be the best way to protect them. But what some of them do is go, well, back off so they're recovered. Well, actually, then you suddenly get a massive spike in load when they go into that tournament structure. And then the other thing they'll do is when they go back to their team sometimes is we need to rest them. You've worked them too hard. We've got to rest them. Well, actually, if their workload went up by 25, 30%, them going to play for their domestic team, their home team is, well, that's fine. That's brilliant. You've suddenly had a decrease in load of 25, 30% compared to
Mhm.
what they had with the national team. So you don't need to rest them because you'll naturally have a deload or a taper effect because they just don't work as hard at that level. Because if you're in the national squad, you're the best of the best, hopefully. And the work rates go up, whether it's men's, women's teams, etc. So it is about managing load and not a case of reducing load. And we've got to think about when's the best time to progressively increase it to prepare people. There are times when you have to go, no, we need to recover. If you are in that tournament structure with a national team and it's a game every 3 days, in between, you haven't got much time to do a lot of training because you have to get them fully recovered because they have to try and win. Because if not, they're knocked out of the tournament and then everyone's in trouble. So
Mhm.
there's definitely an over reliance on let's back off. Or they've worked really hard. Should we do this type of training with them? But going back to the earlier point, if you've pushed them and worked them hard enough outside of that competitive season, and you still have a sufficient load in season, well, it shouldn't be too difficult to give them, at that point, sort of the minimum dose to maintain. And I avoided using the term minimum effective dose because minimum effective to achieve what? Is it maintenance? Is it an increase? Is it, so the minimum that they need to do to maintain that level of performance for a period of time. Because otherwise, what we see sometimes is people keep backing off of that with the load management, and actually the games then become more fatiguing because you're detraining. So you're
Mhm.
working at a higher relative percentage, and by the end of the season, the half of the squad are less fit than they were at the end of pre-season. Well, they should be fitter by that point, especially if you go into a playoff situation.
100%. I was mentored by Coach AJ, and he always spoke about the preseason should be building the armor season, so that when you do get into season, every time post, like your training post game, should be rebuilding that one layer of protection and like maintaining the performance levels to be able to continue through the whole season. Because like there's nothing worse than seeing a team starting really fucking strong in their first game, and by the end of their season, they've lost more games than they've won because they didn't prepare that adequately. In saying that, how would you recommend us trying to individualize these loading factors?
Well, really, by looking at, and that this could be your match performance with GPS, etc. It could be your gym based side of things. It's really looking at, well, what is that training status of that individual? What do they do normally at certain time points, and then scaling all of their performances based on what's normal for them, not normal for the squad or normal for that position. Because as I said earlier, we could cover exactly the same distance, amount of accelerations, decelerations. But if you're fitter, faster, stronger than me, it's not fatiguing for you.
Mhm.
Whereas I'm in a hole for days. So you've got to make sure you individualize that. But the key thing is actually exposing them progressively and incrementally to those higher loads, whether that's the volume that they do in competition, whether that's the intensity or the volume they do in the gym, or for their conditioning training, and just incrementally increasing that so that they have the capacity to do more. Um, because if we've increased your capacity to do more and then it's required of you in a game situation, you don't get in as big a hole. So we've really then got to look and say, well, how does what they've performed in the gym, on the pitch, on the court, wherever it is they're training, how does that compare to what they normally do? Have we had an
Mhm.
increase in load and intensity? If we have, we might need to back off a little bit. Or did we plan for that increase? That's one of the things that you see sometimes when people will be reactive. You've got let's say a 6 week cycle of training, so a 6 week block where you increase the volume or intensity, and they get to about week 4 or 5 and go, oh, they're a little bit sluggish. Jump heights come down, or if you're assessing velocity, velocity is decreased. Didn't you plan for that? Wasn't that the
Mhm.
purpose of the increase in volume over the block? And now you're suddenly going week 4. Oh, they're a little bit fatigued. We should back off. Well, you plan to increase it and fatigue them more in week 5 and then back off in week 6. So that should tell you your plan's working. If that was the plan, you're not always planning
Mhm.
for that, but we need to make sure we're not being too reactive when we are increasing the volume or intensity, because sometimes that's what we're hoping for. And then you've planned a period of deload. Again, if the whole schedule changes, you might deload them early, and you might create almost a mini taper early. But we've got to think about, well, what were we expecting to happen at this end of this block of training? And the example I've used there was, if you're in the gym, but you might have done exactly the same with conditioning. You could have sat there with the head coach and said, look, this is what we're going to do, loads of small sided games. This is our plan. We're going to try and increase aerobic fitness. The volumes are going to increase. They will be a bit fatigued at this stage, but don't worry, because they'll rebound next week or the week after.
You do a lot of research on, or have been part of projects looking at hamstring strength, explosivity, and sort of how to take care of the hamstrings as a whole. I'm a big posterior chain guy. Like, I think that's where strength should really begin, is making sure that you can load your hamstrings, your calves, your lower back. What's some of the most important things that have came out of your research, and why should we like really consider the posterior chain as a fundamental like block?
Um, Again, I think it's going back to those basics. Progressive overload with it. If you use progressive overload, it's going to work. It's going to be fine, and that doesn't matter if that's something like the Nordic hamstring exercise, Romanian deadlifts, sprint training. So one of my previous PhD students, who's now one of my colleagues, Dr. Nick Ripley, has shown in some of his research that actually using a combination of those approaches works really well. The addition of sprint training can still, as long as you're progressively overloading the sprinting, actually create some architectural adaptations in the hamstrings, can increase eccentric strength, similar to what we get with the Nordic hamstring exercise. Put those together along with a Romanian deadlift, you're probably getting to a point where you're starting to bulletproof your hamstrings. Um, Again, there's other things you can throw in there. If you're doing things like kettlebell swings, so it's only a light kettlebell, but you've got that high momentum because the kettlebell's moving at a high velocity, and then you have to rapidly decelerate at that end range of motion. Those sorts of movement patterns work really well. But what we then have to do is say, well, when can we use those types of training appropriately in the competitive season? And as I said earlier, if you take something like the Nordic hamstring exercise out for a period of time, when you reintroduce it, the athlete ends up sore. Same with the Romanian deadlifts. But the key thing is that progressive overload works really well. And then you also have to think about, how should we be loading? So again, if it's the Nordic hamstring exercise, you should be reaching a break point. I've heard loads of coaches go, oh, but my athlete can't make it all the way to the floor. That's good. That means there's a true supramaximal eccentric stimulus. And if they can make it all the way to the floor, fantastic. Give them a weighted vest or something to make it harder. Make it more difficult for them so they still hit that break point. But you don't need massive volumes. If you're working them that hard, that high in intensity, a low volume works. And look at some of the research out there on things like the Nordic hamstring exercise. We know it creates huge adaptations in the muscle in terms of fascicle length and in terms of eccentric strength. But we also know you don't need a massive volume of it. If you look at some of the more recent research or a meta-analysis done by Dr. Matt Cuthbert, who was one of my PhD students, he demonstrated that I think it was as low as 3 sets of 3 repetitions twice a week is enough to create adaptations. But some of the early studies, they were using sets of 10 to 15. Yeah, good luck with that. Whoever came up with that has never performed the Nordic hamstring exercise or has phenomenal hamstrings. And also, if you try and do that, try and do a set of 15. You pace yourself. You're not doing a full. If you go maximum effort, there's no way you're getting
Mhm.
15 reps out. Good luck with that. So again, we have to. That's something easy to critique. If you sat on our isokinetic dynamometer and we're doing an eccentric exercise with maximal effort, are you going to do 3 sets of 15? I hope not, because you're not going to be, if it's your legs, you're not walking the next day. That's going to be painful. That's going to create a lot of muscle damage. So again, as long as you create progressive overload appropriately, and you think about, well, what's the stimulus we're after? So again, like I said, you're getting with something like sprinting, you're getting high force, rapid force production, which can create increases in fascicle length and increases in eccentric strength from sprint training. You get exactly the same adaptations with the Nordic hamstring exercise. You can get them with the Romanian deadlift because you're training at long muscle lengths. So it helps to lengthen the fascicles. So if you're thinking, well, that's the adaptation I'm after, you can use any of those exercises, or you can rotate them around, within a weekly training cycle. But they're all creating similar adaptations. They don't look anything alike. So in terms of saying, is it specific? Well, they don't. No, sprinting is sport specific, obviously, but you're also then exposing the hamstrings to the mechanism that normally causes that injury. So do you want to do that too often? Probably not. Now, the Nordic hamstring exercise, it could be anything. It can even be a hyperextension type exercise loaded that's been shown to give you similar adaptations, or the RDL. They look nothing like the sport in action, but they create the specific adaptations that we're after, increase in eccentric strength and an increase in fascicle length. So the key thing is identifying, well, what do we need to do? What's the adaptation we're after either uh, achieving or maintaining, and what will stimulate that adaptation, and then trying to identify, well, what's the amount, what's the volume, the frequency, the intensity we need to do with those specific exercises. And it varies. It could be much higher volumes of sprinting. It's not going to be 3 sets of 3 sprints like it might be with Nordics. So
Yeah.
I think the key thing is really going back to the basic principles of progressive overload and specific adaptations. How are we stressing those tissues? What's the adaptation we're after? And it's that simple in most cases, but it gets confusing because you have a look at the amount of exercises that have been studied to see if they create those adaptations, and people aren't sure what to do. But also, if
Mm.
you give somebody a high intensity or high volume program, which causes a lot of muscle soreness, they're not coming back to do that again in a couple of days. I've seen it previously just from testing on an isokinetic dynamometer at a high level football club, where the following day we went back in to do more testing. We'd been asked to do this testing, went back in to do more testing. Every single member of that team was in the physio room getting a massage. Some of them saying they'd pulled their hamstrings. You haven't pulled your hamstring. You're just not used to that level of loading. It's muscle soreness. You'll be fine. Give it a
Mhm.
couple of days. But again, the problem is then nobody wants to do that testing in the future again because they were so sore afterwards. So it's making sure that we add the volume and the intensity appropriately in those situations. Otherwise, we can come up with the best training program in the world, but if no one's willing to perform it, it's a
Mm.
really shit training program.
It's the same as a program, and you can build the same exact best world program ever existed. And if the athlete doesn't care for you or like you, that athlete's not going to do it. It's as
Yeah.
simple as. You've also been part of 347 papers according to ResearchGate, and you have been very honest in saying that most of it is collabs with your students and everything else. How does that sort of program at Salford sort of put these PhDs and master students up for success in this manner?
Um, I think part of it is being really, really honest with them. That number of papers that will include things like published abstracts and stuff for conference presentations and those sorts of things as well on ResearchGate. So it's probably not quite that high. I think it's just over 200. I think if you're looking at just actual peer-reviewed papers, which is, I acknowledge, it's still a
It's
lot.
still a lot.
Yeah, yeah. But really, I think we're honest with the students, and we try and get the students, whether it's undergraduate, even masters and PhD students, involved in all of the work we do with teams. I think at the moment, the majority of our PhD students are working in teams. So they're either working full time in a team and doing a part time PhD, which is great because they have access to lots of data. They can collect that data easily, routinely as part of their job. The fallback then is we know how pressured time is in professional sports, so sometimes they're struggling then to write up their PhD thesis. And we've got others who are full time doing their PhD but embedded in a club, again collecting data, etc. So that works really well, and we try and get them to work together. So where we can, we'll certainly try and align master students and PhD students together. So the master's student might be able to use some bits of data that they've collected as an add-on to what the PhD student is doing. And sometimes the data that we're collecting is almost for consultancy purposes, pre-season testing that we're doing in multiple different clubs, which they allow us to use for research purposes. We'll make sure we've got ethics, etc. before. get consent from the players, or if they're young players, get parental or guardian assent so that make sure we can use the data appropriately. And we try and get the students to work together as collaboratively as we can so that they learn from each other. That also means for myself and colleagues that takes some of the pressure off us, because they might send a draft manuscript around 3 or 4 masters and PhD students 4 or 5 times before it comes to me. And by which time, if you've got somebody who's towards the end of their PhD who's already published numerous papers, it's in a really good state. But it means that they learn from each other as well. And they learn part of that process, because if you're reviewing somebody else's manuscript, you read it in a different way to what you read your own.
Mm.
It's almost like when the first time you review a manuscript for a journal, you read that in a totally different way. And there'll be things where you're reading it going, oh, I write like that. That actually is probably not the best way to present it. Or that's a really good way of stating or presenting some information. I'm going to use that in future. So it's really trying to get them to work together, mentor each other, and assist each other along with us, and trying to get them to collaborate as much as possible with us, but also with other people. Um, the focus has to be their PhD or their masters, but if they have the time and they have the capacity then to do extra things on the side, then we get them involved in doing that. Some
Mm.
really, really thrive in that environment. Some start to get a bit overwhelmed. So then you start going, right, okay, let's back off. The focus is your PhD or your master's. Whereas others, can multitask and they're great at juggling things. But that's the same with staff in academia.
Mm.
I've got some of my colleagues who go, right, I need to focus just on this. Once I've done that, I can move on and I can do something different. But I can't keep going from something on hamstrings to weightlifting to force plate testing, etc. I need to focus on that one component. Um, so yeah, it's really trying to get them to work as collaboratively as possible, learn from each other, learn from us. I learn from them. That's one of the best things about supervising PhD students is once they're halfway through their PhD, most of them, when they're really good, they know more about the topic than me. If
Mm.
let's say for example now I've got I think 10 PhD students, a couple due to complete anytime now. I can't spend the amount of time reading research that they do. So I'll turn around to some of them and say, right, let's go and grab a coffee, or let's go for a beer, or we'll get everyone together and give us a summary on what you've been doing on your systematic review or on this study. Let's talk through different things. Let's have a discussion or debate over a specific topic. And it would be nice to have more time to do some more on that. But unfortunately, I still have to teach and do other things at the same time. But you can really learn from those people, and allowing those
Mm.
students to know that you're expecting to learn from them. I want them to challenge me on certain things. I don't want to be turning around, at the start of the third year of their PhD and saying, "Are you sure about this?" I want them to be coming to me very definitive. Look, I've done all the reading. All of the evidence indicates this. This doesn't seem to be the best method or the most appropriate way of doing things. And that's brilliant because it upskills me and it upskills everyone else around us.
Does your experience from being in the weight room and being in general population sort of has that transferred over to building this sort of culture with your PhD and master students?
Yeah, I think so. Because again, you want to be helping each other, whether it's, just like you would do if you're training with a team in a weight room. You want to be helping each other. You want to be taking ownership of certain things and taking responsibility, learning from each other. And more than anything, thinking about, well, what does work? It's no good coming up
Mm.
with a training program if you've never lifted a weight, because you're going to have no idea. Simple things like that's probably where the sets of 10 and 15 Nordics came from. Somebody had never really thought about it, had never performed them with any real intent, and thought, oh, that would be okay for everyone. So one of the things to do is actually go and try things, try stuff yourself. I did it with. I was examining one of Greg Huff's PhD students, and I was reading the thesis of James Tofano, and he was looking at cluster sets.
Mm.
So it was 80 or 85% of 1RM for 12 reps. And I'm thinking, you can't do that, not a chance. So I put the thesis down, went down to our weight room, thought, right, okay, let's give it a try. So I've been doing 5 sets of 5 at that point. I was doing front squats, and I thought that's safer in case I fail as well. I'm not going to get stuck under the bar. So got the load I was doing for 5 sets of 5, and I did a set of 3, paused for 10 seconds, picked it back up, another set of 3, picked it back up, another 3, then another 3. That was my cluster of 12. Got to the end and thought, well, actually, I've just done that. But in this in this one study, they did that three sets. Let's give it 2.5 minutes. Let's go again. Heart rate's obviously doing this.
Mhm.
Do the next set, managed it, did the third set, thought, okay, I was wrong. This was right. You can do it. That's awesome. So now I've got a much higher volume. Finished off the rest of my training session, could hardly walk the next day. But if you think about it, you think about the volume I'd been doing. So I'd been doing 5 sets of 5 at that load. I then just ended up doing, so instead of 25 reps, I ended up doing 36 reps. What a massive increase in volume. That was
Yep.
stupid. Why did I do that? But you've got to go and try it, say what this works. And now I know, don't suddenly try and implement that. You
Mhm.
know, you're on
Well,
20, you're on 25 reps normally. Well, maybe we up it to like 26, 28 repetitions, and then we add to those clusters over a couple of sessions. But if you're not used to training, and that any type of training, that could be aerobic conditioning. Somebody says to you, go and do 4x4 minute intervals at 90 to 95% of maximum heart rate. Go and try it first. That's not easy. You might sometimes need more than 3 or 4 minutes to recover in between because your heart rate's up here and it is not coming back down for a while.
mhm.
That could just be my age and fitness. But you've got to give some of these things a try. And the nice thing is, a lot of our PhD students, especially when they can or when they're based at the university, will come in. They'll lift with us in the mornings. You also have some fantastic discussions at that point as well, and we'll try and
Mm.
implement
Okay.
certain things and a bit of trial and error, see what happens.
Yeah. I've got a question, and apart from one person, you might know him, Gil Stevenson. He does a conditioning circuit with his athletes at the end of the session, and it's if I'm not so it depends on the time, and you can go between 15, 30 to 45 seconds. You do a clean, like from sort of a pull to a catch and then up. And then, so you do that for the set timing. How has that sort of, how applicable is that? And why does it, do you think it works for the purpose of developing the conditioning through weights?
Yeah, it can definitely work. Again, go back to that said principle. If the aim is to get your heart rate up to a certain intensity and maintain it there, we know what it's like. If we do exercise, like I said, if you do a clean pull into a clean with that full depth catch, and then you have to squat out of it, maybe do an extra squat or two, or a push press, split jerk, whatever at the end. You don't have to do a lot of that, and your heart rate goes up high. And then if you are, every 30, 40 seconds, you're repeating that. It's like a lot of people use every EMOM, every minute on the minute.
Hmm.
So you can go and do, something like that sort of cycle of exercises. You can do your clean pull into a hang power clean, or into a hang clean, into a split jerk, put the bar down, get your breath. By the time you're on your probably second or third time of doing that, your heart rate's up really high. So as long as your technique doesn't break down, and as long as you've loaded it appropriately, if your heart rate's staying up at 80% of maximum heart rate, and you can keep that there for 20 or 30 minutes, you've just had a good aerobic training stimulus. You need to be technically proficient enough to do that without technique breaking down and risking injury. You also need to load it appropriately so you can do those exercises. But again, the one thing to bear in mind with that is if you've never done it before, you can achieve a really high volume doing that,
Hmm.
which can be very fatiguing. Which, going back to the time of the pandemic, I had minimal equipment to be able to use. I had a barbell with a set amount of weight. You couldn't squat the loads that you'd like to squat because you can't clean it to pick it up, and you're not going to rest it on your bins, on the wheelie bins, because it's probably going to go through them. So you could do that type of training. You get a phenomenal training effect from different training methods just because you ended up with a high volume. But again, then we've got to say, well, when's the best time to do this? If you're suddenly getting a big increase in volume for that individual athlete, you're probably not going to be doing that in season. But if you've done that pre-season and the athlete's conditioned, that could be a good conditioning circuit, especially for rugby players, etc., who need to have muscle mass. You've done a high volume, that's going to help. Give them a high intensity aerobic stimulus at the same time, but you just need to have sequenced those exercises appropriately. But it can be a really effective way of training. We need more research on that.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of working with Gil, and like that. set of movement was like very intriguing to me because like obviously I'd done circuit training. I know it builds the CV as well as some muscular adaptations to it. But it's the first time that I've seen Olympic weightlifting done to increase conditioning for athletes. So for me, it was like, okay, we're using a percentage of our 1RM for it. So we're kind of working that muscular adaptation. We're also chasing the endurance. So for me, it was like I love Olympic weightlifting. I think we've discussed this. So for me, it was really good because like I got two of my loves and sort of they're married now and I'm getting to experience this. You've also just mentioned that there's a little bit more research that needs to go into that. What would be your sort of what would be your hypothesis if this was to be a study?
Well, I suppose you'd have to figure out exactly what the overall aim was, but your hypothesis would be that you can increase, you know, cardiovascular fitness as well as you might want to monitor muscle strength or endurance simultaneously and get comparable adaptations, if not better adaptations, to other methods of training. If you compared it to standard circuit training, if we get the
Mm,
same heart rate, we'd get a similar aerobic adaptation. Same heart rate, similar period of time, that's the same stimulus on the cardiovascular system. But if we then compared body weight circuit training to something like weightlifting exercises where we're doing that uh, mixture of a couple of different movement patterns, and it is every 30 seconds or every minute on the minute, if you've got much higher stimulus for the muscular system, your hypothesis then would be that that would be superior to circuit training for increasing strength, power, endurance, etc. And that would make sense. For some people, they might not be able to do that. And it might be you start off with circuit training and you progress. But if you compared those two types of training, or if you compared, trying to be time efficient, if you were doing your aerobic conditioning separately and you're doing your sort of weightlifting and strength training separately, we've suddenly got potentially double the duration that you've got to train for, if not more.
mhm.
So yeah, it'd be really interesting to look at. What we'd have to figure out though is, what loads are most appropriate, and that will vary
Yeah.
between individuals. I know Nick Ripley that I mentioned earlier, one of my colleagues. He'll go in and use really, really heavy loads every minute on the minute, doing certain exercises, and I'm watching him thinking, how is this guy not dying? Why does it not sound like he's having an asthma attack? If I tried that at that percentage of my 1RM, which is not as high as his, I'd really be struggling. But he's got a phenomenal engine. He's strong and aerobically he's really fit as well. Whereas for me, yeah, it would definitely improve my fitness, but it might leave me lead on the floor after 10 minutes if I worked at
Mm,
that pace. So, it's how do you set the intensities for both the load, the rest period, but then
times.
also what heart rate you're trying to achieve. And
Mhm.
you probably have to start conservatively and then decide, well, do you upload or do you reduce rest periods?
Yeah, the
But there's
most
so much work
fascinating.
that can be done.
I know. It's actually amazing that he's not done it yet, because
Yeah.
like, or written articles about it. I know he likes his articles, and I've been like, this is dope. One thing that I find even more fascinating to that is, so it's usually based on a three set principle, and it goes, you try and achieve as many reps as possible. So say you start your first set is at 97 beats per minute, right? That's you, or sorry, 97% of your max heart rate, right? So it's in that red. You can only go again when your heart rate gets down to blue, and then you go into so that's like your rest time. That red into blue is your rest time. You then go again. Say you get 98, which you should. Your second set, you should be more exhausted than the first one. And then again, your rest time is that blue. You go again, third set. If that third set increases again, so say you're at 99% now, you do a fourth set. But if you don't, if it goes down, then that's you done. If it increases again, you do a fourth set. And by that point, you're already goosed. But, and I've asked him, and like his thing is like, I want them to decrease really quickly. So that's sort of building that engine capacity for their heart rate to drop down quickly, so they're aware that they have to do it again at some point. Yeah, that fourth set is really damaging, but it's like in a good way because like you can see how much that heart rate sort of stabilizes quicker as the plan continues.
Yeah. And again, these sorts of approaches all depend on exactly what the overall end
Mhm.
goal is, what's the adaptation we're trying to stimulate. That sounds pretty brutal. Whereas you could do it and just maintain heart rate at a almost somewhere between 85 and 75% of max heart rate. So you get up to 85 during the set. Once it drops to 70 or 75%, you step back to the bar and go again. So you wouldn't even necessarily need to time it. You could
Mhm.
literally just look at your heart rate response if you've got a smart watch on or you've got a heart rate monitor, and then that's telling you when you're ready to go for that next set. Then you could go for a more prolonged period of time. You can't do that if you're up in the 90%.
Mhm.
Like you said, I think you just describe it as you goosed, and you would be. So again, that in itself, just those two different approaches, they're really, really high intensity, but for a much shorter duration, or keep somebody between 70 and 85% of maximum heart rate. And as soon as they're down at that 70, 75, start your next set, go again. Um, and you could do that for a much more prolonged period of time.
Mhm.
But yeah,
No,
there's so much you could do.
100%. And I think this is what I like about this industry so much is like you do have 1,001 ways to skin the cat, but it's
Yeah,
how are you going to do it differently and to still be able to keep your athletes going for as long. Um, what would be some advice that you would give new strength and conditioning coaches or coaches coming into the industry?
read, read a lot, and also where you can try and get somebody good to mentor you and go and watch other people coaching. Observe other people coaching, get involved if they'll allow you to, um, and watch people coaching from a range of different sports as well. Because I've been privileged enough over the last 20 plus years, normally at things like conferences, UKSCA conference, with practical sessions that I used to do a hell of a lot of, was people like Gil Stevenson coaching weightlifting, um, Professor Kyle Pierce, Leo Totten, people like that. Actually, watching them coaching weightlifting. I went out to Edith Cowan University about 5 years ago with Greg to spend some time with Greg Huff and watched his wife, Erin Huff, coach. And again, all these different people, you can see them looking at a group of people training in a training facility, but spotting things from across the room and shouting one simple command or one
Hmm.
simple cue, and suddenly the technique improves, and you're like, "Wow, how did that happen?" And then straight away you're in there saying, "Right, what did you notice? How could you tell that was going wrong? Why that specific cue?" And you pick up ideas from people all the time doing that, and it's also saying something like imitation is the best form of flattery. And
Hmm.
what I've said to people, like, I've used that cue ever since, or I've done this in this way, and I've seen that. And getting exposure to that, you'll learn so much. Because if you've got somebody there that's got 20, 30 years of experience, especially if they've been coaching full time and you've only got a little bit of experience, you can just get so much out of that.
Hmm.
But also being
That's,
open to asking them why. How did you see it? What
mhm,
did you see? Because you can watch it and sometimes you're like, I can't see it. That looks awesome. Can't see why they keep failing the snatch. Looks great. And then suddenly they'll tell you it was just their setup position at the start. You're like, well, how did that happen? They'll explain what happens throughout the entire kinetic chain, and you're going, wow, yeah, that really simplified it. So you knew they were going to fail before the bar came off the floor.
mhm.
Brilliant. But that you learn so much. So you've got to do the reading, you've got to read the scientific literature, and don't just read like a lot of universities now. Don't know why, but people at universities sometimes are telling students not to read anything or reference stuff more than 5 or 10 years old. That's stupid. There's so much research going back. I mentioned Delorme earlier, 1930s and 40s. Look at A.V. Hill's stuff on force velocity characteristics of muscles. If most of the people talking about velocity-based training and load velocity relationships read that work, they'd realise why some of their research isn't as good as it could be. Um, Generalizing, not everyone, but you see some stuff. I get to review a lot of research in different journals, and sometimes people just haven't grasped some of the basic concepts because they haven't read the old literature.
Yep.
And that also means go and learn from the older coaches as well. But also, the nice thing is sometimes the older coaches will learn from the younger coaches that are developing as well, because they'll ask questions which you haven't thought of. I get that from students all the time. Why do we do it this way? Why have we not done it this way instead? And you sit there and go, "It's a really good question. No idea. Never thought of that." You do that. That is great. So be open and willing to learn, but also put in the time and effort.
It's that principle of being a sponge, and like again, I always vocalize my thoughts, which sometimes does get me into trouble. But like, even when I was like in internships, like I asked questions often, and like I made sure that even if I noticed the slightest change, I was like, why? Like, and it could do exactly what you just said. Like, there was one instance where we were doing speed development one day, and then the next day we were doing a little bit of speed development, but there was a little bit more emphasis on the COD. And it wasn't major. There was just one exercise that changed in the warm up. And I was like, that's different. Why? And there was like, well, we're doing a little bit of COD today. So we're trying to make sure that those muscles are adequately warm so we can mitigate the injury risks. And I was like, huh. But it's like even every single like even if it's a very minute change, try pick up on it and ask why. Like, and again, some of the answers might, and again, if people don't want to answer, that should say more about the program than you or the way you're doing it. Because that's one thing. Like, I've had a lot of rejection in this field, so like you can't help that. That's more on them than it is you. But more times than not, people are open to talk about their program and their systems and the way they do
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, and I think it's about how you ask the question.
Hmm.
You're not saying to somebody that's wrong. You're saying, right, I've seen this done differently, or we were taught differently about this at university, or I read this study last week, or I heard somebody else present at a conference. They do it a slightly different way. Can you talk me through why you do it this way? What's the rationale? I want to learn. I want to know and understand. Um,
Hmm.
and it is getting it across in that right manner so that somebody doesn't get a little bit defensive. But most
Yeah,
people, especially those that are more experienced, are more than happy to sit and discuss and debate things with you, and that's brilliant because then again, everyone learns. And sometimes
100%.
somebody will say, "Why are you doing it that way?" And you'll go, "Why am I doing it this way? I should have thought
It's
this
also
through."
that critical thinking.
Yeah,
Like, you've done something so long that you're like, yeah, this is just what works. But then someone
yeah,
questions in you, and you're like, okay, you can't just say, oh, it's I've just always done that way. You need to justify, like,
yeah,
okay, I do this because I've seen the most success in building whatever it is this way.
yeah,
Back to an earlier point that you made, m- I'm going to call my university out on this, and my university was 5 years or more to like if it was past 5 years from the time we were in that research, you should avoid it. And there was a lot of stuff that, again, for my dissertation, it was on women's athletes' perception on strength and conditioning coaches' behaviors, and like there's not a lot on female ever. So like if I could find one, it was an old one. So I was kind of like, can I not use it? So it becomes a little bit harder to focus on these very specific questions when all the research is backdated more than that as well.
yeah. Yeah, and it's very common, but you need to go back to the original sources because sometimes that's been done better than stuff that's done now.
Hmm.
Other times we're finding different results because technology has changed or improved over time. But you need to know where all of it came from. And unfortunately, you look back to some of those translated European texts and everything. It could be super training, it can be, any of Verkhoshansky's early work, etc. But you go back and look at some of those which are easily accessible, and there's principles in there that maybe weren't actually substantiated via research as we would class it now, but they'd found it had worked with athletes. And it's
Hmm.
only now that the researchers have identified, well, yes, this does work, or it doesn't work in this situation, or actually, if we tweak this and we refine it, this is when we get greater potentiation, or these rest periods on cluster sets are more effective, whatever it might be. But you can go back decades and find, that actually we're not creating anything really, really new now. Actually, all we're
Hmm.
doing is most of the time refining it, tweaking it, slightly improving it. But you've got to go back to that old research first of all. And it's, if you're lucky enough to chat with people that have been doing this for 3 or 4 decades, that's really, really insightful because sometimes I'll say, oh, we did a study back in the day. And then you go and search for it and go, I can't find it. Oh, no, it's one we didn't publish. You're like, why? Why not?
Oh
That
shit!
could have been really
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah,
The
I
publication
guess there will be
process
a
was
lot of
much
that.
slower back then.
I guess. I actually found Tim's Halloween costume very funny, and it was like the peer reviewer too, and it's that thing where research gets scrutinized so much that like by the time you're on your first, second, third peer reviewed like person, you're just like fuck.
Yeah, and it varies. You know, I've had it. I've had one manuscript that I can think of that had five reviewers because the first reviewer said accept outright, second reviewer said reject outright, third reviewer minor revisions. So they brought in two extra reviewers. So yeah, it's
uh,
interesting. The problem is there are limitations as you go through the process more, and like with editorial roles in journals, you start seeing what a good review is and a bad review is. And Tim could tell we had a review recently where all the way through it's like I disagree with this, I disagree with this, I disagree with this. Okay, fine, but tell us why, or point us in the direction of
mm,
the research that you've read, which has led you to disagree with this, so that we can look at it and actually make an informed decision. Other reviewers will come back and say, it would be good to go away and read X, Y, and Z. And that's the way I try and do it with my students. Rather than saying to them, this is wrong, this is right, or right, here's some more research, go away and read that, make up your own decision, critique it. But yeah, unfortunately, the review process can be brilliant and it can be great. You can learn from it. Other times, you just get stuff and go, "This is really not helpful." Okay, so
yeah,
the reviewer one, two, three, whoever disagrees with it, they haven't told you why. They haven't told you where any of the research has come from that makes them disagree with it. So how do you respond to that? That would be like me turning around to a student going, "Well, I failed you," but with no feedback. I
yeah.
failed you. I disagree. How is that helpful for anyone?
100%. Um, I've I got inspired by an interview recently, and I think it's one question that I want to start asking coaches and researchers and people in this industry where we're getting pulled a million and one different ways all the time. What in your life, apart from obviously your job, where do you have the most fun?
Um, Obviously, you do get a lot with the job, and that they merge into one.
Hmm.
So one thing that I'm really fortunate, and we spoke about this earlier before we started, is I'm really fortunate. I get to travel quite a lot, go to different conferences, etc. So you get to see more of the world. That's great. Where I can, I'll take my wife along with me, which keeps her happy, which then means I'm not in trouble for being out of the country too much. And actually, to get to go and travel and experience things together, or some of your colleagues, if you've been attending conferences for multiple years, they're no longer colleagues; they become like friends. Like an extended part of your family, and just going and catching up with those people. And the strength and conditioning world it is like an extended family. I always feel now if I go over to the NSCA conference, or recently I was at the ASCA conference in Australia, and you walk into the room, you've got no idea who's going to be there or how many people you'll know. But you just know so many people, and they're so friendly. They want to take you for a beer. They want to take you and show you around part of the city or whatever. You go out for some food. It's great because it is like you've got this huge family around you. I would imagine not everyone feels that way about it, but yeah, it's great, and it does mean that you end up having quite a bit of fun as well. You're working hard. You're still getting to experience that extra bit of time in other countries, and enjoy some of the culture you might not normally. And I'm also lucky. My family are pretty much grown up, so at different times I'll go to a conference and they might come along so that we can spend a few days or a week afterwards at a similar venue. So my daughter and her partner came out to the NSCA conference in New Orleans a few years ago. My son and his girlfriend came out to Vegas was it 2 years ago? Might be 2 years ago. So again, you get to share that, and they get to actually see a bit of what I do at work as well as being able to go out and actually, enjoy yourself as well and have a bit of a holiday with it.
I appreciate you so much for coming on today and breaking down some of the research and the way that this industry is sort of heading and where we can benefit from again research and how to apply it to our real life jobs. If you let everyone know where they can sort of find you and reach out to you.
Twitter and Instagram probably the easiest. It's Poor Comfort 1975, which gives away my age. Um, yeah, there or on ResearchGate as well. They'll find my publications. Whatever's allowed to be shared on there will be shared on there. Whatever's not allowed to be shared won't be shared. I've for some reason people keep asking me for entire a PDF of an entire book. You're like, I can't share that. That's in breach of copyright. Why would I go and buy the book?
I
And
think you're
that's one of
referencing
them.
to this.
Definitely one of them. But you wouldn't believe the amount of people that come back. Can you send me each individual chapter, or can you send me the entire book? No, I'm not breaching copyright for you. Go and buy
Yeah,
it.
I can imagine that. And the thing is, like, a lot of people turn these into PDFs once they have the book as well.
Yeah,
So a lot of people get access to it. Um, I'm always in two minds about it. Like, for students, it's kind of hard to widely research and do more knowledge based things when there is so many paywalls.
yeah.
But at the same time, you kind of like someone's poured like hours into this as well. So you kind of have to balance that out.
Yeah, and also as a student, choose your university well. Pick someone a university where they've got good access to all of the peer-reviewed journal articles. They've got e-versions of the books. Normally it might be only 50 people can access that textbook at any one time. Well, it's not that often that 50 students will be reading the same
Mhm.
chapter of a book. So it does make it quite easy to access that. Um, and there's multiple different ways of doing it. You could even, I know some of our students, or one will say they'll buy one book, one will buy another. They're sharing a house. There's 5 or 6 of them in the house. They'll buy a book each. They've now got 5 or 6 books that they can read, um, and that works quite well.
Um, I will also link a website where I got most of my textbooks from, and like it's really good because you can get the real books, but just at a fraction of the price because they are secondhand and it's sort of
Yeah,
again rehoming books. Um, and I've got a lot of my textbooks here and shopped around. But funny story, I was at Abertay University, which isn't a huge university, but I chose it specifically for the physiology program, the psychology program, and who was at that point the S&C, but now teams have changed, and I think I've made my thoughts clear on that program um, on this podcast enough. But my partner was at Dundee University, which is obviously a much bigger school. So if there was research papers I couldn't find through Abertay, I would just to get her login and just try and find something.
yeah,
So if you've got friends in different universities, that's a good option too.
yeah. Or send them the list of articles that you want, and they can access them and just forward them onto you as a PDF.
Yeah, that's what I did. No, I really appreciate you, Paul, for coming on and sharing your time.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
Peace.